Welcome back to Retro Rebound. In today's video, we are going back to a ton of Spider-Man games. Now, you may have realized we were on a big roll heading into the release of Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man video after Spider-Man video after Spider-Man video, all wrapping up with the Remembering the Spider-Man games video, which I was immensely proud of, and I thought that was a good time to take a break. You see, I am a massive Spider-Man fan, if the costume and the amount of content we've created around this series hasn't told you anything. And I didn't want it to become a content factory sort of thing. Our most viewed video on the channel was actually talking about Spider-Man 3, but I think it's because there was purpose behind it, right? We compared and contrasted all the various versions of Spider-Man 3, why it was actually pretty good, why it was bad in some areas, and we've done that with that level of attention to detail to every game that has come out of this beloved franchise. So I wanted to make sure after we went really hard that we didn't just keep rolling because the viewership was good on it. I wanted to take a break, try some other things, and when I came back, I had this idea where I want to make a dedicated video on every Spider-Man game, but I know some are more sensible than others. Some you can't really get a full video out of. It's like getting blood out of a stone. And so what I came to a conclusion with is I wanted to do this compilation style video of playing the worst Spider-Man games. Now I put that in quotes because I've gone through a number of lists online, combing through every Spider-Man game from the Atari ones to Separation Anxiety on SNES and so on and so forth to see what is being ranked as the worst Spider-Man games. And I've come down to 6 different Spider-Man games that I had to try out for myself. Now this isn't the last time we're going to do this. Maybe we do it again with more games, but I wanted to try this as a bit of a tester to see how you feel about putting a bunch of Spider-Man games together in one video instead of doing singular dedicated videos over and over and over. So we'll see how it goes, but nonetheless, I played a bunch of Spider-Man games to start this year. Let's talk about them, shall we? Ladies and gentlemen, if you're new here and you're into nostalgic retrospective content, or of course, the Spidey boy, you know, the franchise, not me. I mean, you could be into me. That's cool too. You're in the right place. Consider subscribing. I want to start off with Spider-Man Web of Shadows. No, not that one. Not the one that we all think is lit because you can decide to cheat on MJ as a evil path choice. No, I'm talking about the other Web of Shadows, the Amazing Allies edition. Yeah, did you know about this one? So there was Web of Shadows on the 360. That's the one that we all love. And then there was Web of Shadows on PS2. And it's actually a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. It has similar themes, but this is one of the most ridiculous Spider-Man games I have played, which is true to what Web of Shadows is. One of the reasons we love this game is, I mean, look at the intro for God's sake. Spider-Man walking with complete turmoil. It's absolute pandemonium around him, and he's just sulking in his feels, right? So it's a similar level of emo-ness, early 2000s emo-ness that you're feeling in this game, except it's got more of an edge to it. This game has dialogue choices, and when you read some of the responses, like Spider-Man will go on for a whole-on 4 sentences trying to disrespect someone because he's got the black suit. I mean, it's pretty hilarious at times. The gameplay obviously is not a strong suit here. It definitely is the poor man's Web of Shadows. Like, we have Web of Shadows at home, honey. But probably the funniest thing about this game is the ending. And bless your soul if you had this game and you got to the end of it. Because I could see this being one of those types of gifts. Mom, I want Spider-Man, Web of Shadows. Grandma, I want Web of Shadows. Oh, here you go. Great, I got it. This isn't what I saw on TV. What the hell is this? So you beat the game in an hour and a half, 2 hours, and this is what you see. That's it. Good job. You beat the game. I have never seen this in a video game before. Could not believe it. What? Unbelievable. Yeah, so this one, I have to say, is pretty awful. This next one, I actually didn't see on many lists online. It was a personal selection from my childhood. For those of you who are dedicated Retro Rebound viewers, you'll know we made a video called Remembering the Toy Story video games. It was in there that we talked about naturally the lineage of Toy Story games, and one that we parked it on for a while was Toy Story 2, which had multiple versions that were completely different from one another. While the PS1 and N64 versions were really fun, you had Toy Story 2 on the Game Boy Color, and it was kind of like a horror game. And so then you have another Matty pickup from when he was a kid. You know, I was the licensed game guy, if you will. So yeah, I got Spider-Man 2, Return of the Sinister Six. This is one that traumatized me. It was one of those games that when I fired back up, I thought to myself, oh wow, All the bad memories are floating back in. Just like when we did a Remembering the Batman video games video, and I talked about the Batman Beyond video game on Game Boy Color. That one also traumatized me. It's just something about these licensed games, man. It's why I celebrate today's amazing anime games, amazing superhero games, because I know what it was like to buy one of those, pick it off the store shelf because the box art was sick, and you open it up and you're like, this is awful. So, Spider-Man 2, Return to the Sinister Six, is a game naturally about Spider-Man fighting back against the Sinister Six. It opens up with you fighting against Mysterio in an amusement park. You fight some of the most hilarious-looking enemies, like dudes in bear costumes and people with guns and clown costumes, and it's just an insane amount of enemies. My biggest problem with this one is what I always had an issue with when it came to 2D Spider-Man. I don't know where to go. In the first level, you need to hit 3 switches to unlock the sewers. So I remember as a kid hitting the 3 switches and hunting all over the map to try and find the entrance to the sewers. I died time in, time out. Playing it as an adult, a little bit easier. But yeah, this game isn't that great. I don't think Spider-Man works really well in a 2D plane, but he was forced to that for many, many years. And then finally escaped with really like Spider-Man 64, right? But Spider-Man 2, Return of the Sinister Six, I really like the soundtrack still. This wasn't like that moment I had with Batman Beyond where I was like, oh my god, this thing, no. This is actually a soundtrack that, you know what, like when you're going through the amusement park and then it picks up the tempo a bit when you're fighting Mysterio, I liked it. The boss mechanics were simple. It wasn't as bad as I remembered from my childhood. I kind of got into a rhythm with it, but, you know, 2D Spider-Man just, doesn't work. But it can work if it's built around a particular game type, like a beat 'em up, and we got 2 to talk about. You may remember from one of our GameStop hauls, Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage. This one is awesome because it is a red cartridge that they shipped it with, which I think makes it a little more unique. It reminds me of, for me as a kid, I grew up with Spider-Man 64, so getting that red N64 cartridge was one of my favorite memories as a gamer starting my career, if you will. So, Spider-Man Maximum Carnage. Naturally, the excitement was flowing through me when I was firing this one up because, for those who don't know, one thing I've been begging for some Marvel video game to do is really lean into Carnage. And I'm not talking about like what Spider-Man 2 did with the little weird sequel tease. Like, no, that kind of stuff makes me ill. Same thing with Amazing Spider-Man 2, where they had the opportunity to build a whole game around Carnage and did very little with it. I think the scariest rendition we got of Carnage was, I'm gonna go back to it once more, Spider-Man 64. Carnage sounded like a psychopath in that game, as he should. And so to see a game here from an earlier era where we weren't maybe, you know, trying to appease a younger audience, I thought, okay, let's see where this one goes. This is a really interesting game, and I'm surprised to find it ranked so low across so many lists out there as one of the worst Spider-Man games, to the point where I think most of these lists, people didn't even play these games. Because Spider-Man Maximum Carnage and its sequel, Separation Anxiety, we'll talk about them both individually, they're really difficult games, which I think can be off-putting, but there's a cult following to them, and I think for good reason. I would not call these the worst Spider-Man games. For example, Maximum Carnage, there's this respect factor that's attached to it because this is a game that was one of the first to really build a story off an existing comic, which back then, for those who don't know, the common thing was like, oh, Spider-Man, slap it on the box. We'll talk about one that's exactly like that on the NES. Slap it on the box, ship it, nice, we got the comic book money. This was the first game to really try to take some inspiration from an existing comic book. For another generation, it was their Spider-Man 64, if you will, like taking stuff from the comic, putting it into a video game. Just like for me, I love Spider-Man 64 because the comic panel cutscenes, that type of stuff spoke to me. That was a really big moment for me as a kid. So for a lot of people, that's what Maximum Carnage was, but I never owned an NES or an SNES, so unfortunately I got to these games extremely late. So the story is about how a symbiote had naturally infected Cletus Cassidy, and now Spider-Man and Venom have decided to call a bit of a peace treaty and say, okay, look, this guy is wreaking havoc across NYC. We need to team up. Otherwise, if we keep fighting each other, this whole city's going to tear itself apart. So I love not only that it's based on the comic books, but that the story sounds awesome. I would love to see this in a big AAA video game where, by the way, because we couldn't even get into movies, man, I want to see the murderous, awful piece of garbage psychopath that is Cletus Cassidy and Carnage go hog wild in a video game. I want an M-rated, I know, I'm dreaming here. I want an M-rated Spider-Man game that takes full advantage of all of that. So for me, a game built around Carnage as the main villain, a little biased here, but yeah, like, I love that stuff. So to me, as a beat 'em up, it's pretty tough, but definitely not one of the worst Spider-Man games I have played. Is it my favorite? No. Again, I'm not crazy about Spider-Man in the 2D plane, but this is during the era of like SNES games that were getting a ton of beat 'em ups. You had, of course, like Turtles in Time. You had Double Dragon. You had the Power Rangers, the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers game, which I love on the SNES. So this is just another one of my favorite IP having that style of game. And I love that. That's great to me. So it was even better when I found out there's this sequel that is named it's a very interesting title, Separation Anxiety. Spider-Man and Venom, Separation Anxiety. And so this is the sequel to Maximum Carnage. And I was looking up reviews for these older games because, you know, I'm not necessarily aware of what was happening around that time. I was not even a twinkle in your eye. I was not alive. So for me, I was thinking to myself, like, what were people thinking about the follow-up to this kind of game? Because Maximum Carnage was, you know, mixed reception. Some thought it was at least decent, though. Whereas Separation Anxiety, some people really didn't like. Now, Separation Anxiety I found a bit more challenging for sure, but it's a continuation of Maximum Carnage where it's leaning into the Venom Lethal Protector comic series. So basically that means that Venom was going to take care of San Francisco and Spider-Man was going to take over NYC. And basically there was like a trust thing, like, okay, as long as you don't do crime, Venom, we're going to let you free. And it turns out that people start attacking Venom, and Spider-Man sees Venom going crazy in San Fran, and he's like, okay, I got to go do something about that because you're breaking our pact here. And it turns out, obviously, he's being misled. So really interesting story as well. But I think if there was one thing that made Separation Anxiety like this really cool Spider-Man game, it's the guest characters that can appear. It reminds me a bit of Web of Shadows on the 360, where one thing I really loved about that game was how you had like Luke Cage and Wolverine, like all these characters showing up and you're working with them in meaningful ways and you're making meaningful choices as well attached to them. And in this game, like you can call in Ghost Rider as an assist. You can call in Captain America, Hawkeye, Daredevil. I love that type of stuff, man. Like that is the crossover stuff that I need in my life. And so it's done in a way that I think is really fun for an arcadey style video game. I don't think it moves the gameplay forward in any other meaningful ways where, yeah, I could see why there would be some fatigue. Like after Maximum Carnage, you just get another beat 'em up. It's like another entry, and that's really it. So I can see why people are less favorable toward Separation Anxiety. But these are two games that I see often are ranked really low and saying like, yeah, these are some of the worst Spider-Man games. I don't really think so. I think they're a really good time. Are they simple? Yes, but I think when you look at the heritage and what it stood for during its time period and how it's aged, I think the cult following is deserved, where I don't find it to be some of the worst Spider-Man game I personally played. But, you know, that was that, and now we're talking about an NES game. We're talking about another Sinister Six game. If you didn't know, Marvel really loves the Sinister Six and Spider-Man. Yeah, Spider-Man, the Sinister Six for NES. Not a great game. I mean, you just look at it, you can see, like, even if you're just looking at a still image, you look at the Spider-Man sprite and you go, okay, something's clearly off here. This game, it just doesn't look right. Like that's like the first thing you got to get right with these kinds of games. It's a pixel art game. Pixel art isn't easy. I get that. But like, you had one job. Like you at least had to look the part. And Spider-Man, just like his legs are way shorter than his arms and his torso. He's weirdly disproportionate. It just stood out to me. It's a very hoppy game. Like you're jumping around a lot. Enemies are very fixed. So like you'll jump behind an enemy with a gun and he'll just keep shooting down the level. It's clearly stitched together by Scotch tape, this game. Like you can just feel the unfinished energy here for sure. And this is perfectly an example of what I think is wrong with Spider-Man in a 2D plane. It reminds me of some of the old NES Batman games and just how terrible they also felt, where you realize there are some who get it, like The Adventures of Batman and Robin, and there's some who don't, which is like Batman on the NES. It's also very little webbing stuff involved here, which is a pretty key component of the Spider-Man games. Like at least even the other Sinister Six game I've talked about on Game Boy Color had like webbing and it was interactive in that sense, but this game is just surface level of Spider-Man game and otherwise an awful 2D platformy kind of beat 'em up Spider-Man game that you should not add to your collection at all. The last Spider-Man game that I wanted to talk about is actually one we've briefly discussed time in and time out on the channel. I don't really want to make a dedicated video to it because I think long term it's just so boring, but it starts out so fun, and that, I hate to say, but it's Spider-Man Friend or Foe. I love that on the PS2 version it starts off with Prowler. Like, I think that's kind of bold. Again, back then, you know, we know Prowler now because of really the Spider-Verse movies and his gradual inclusion in the Miles Morales video game, but Prowler wasn't this known name at the time. That this was during the Raimi trilogy at the end of all of that, so this wasn't a known name. For him to be one of the starting party members was kind of surprising. It was a lot of, who the heck is this guy, for I'd say 80% of people playing the game. So I respect that, and I think the game feels good, like the up aerial combos and the slam attacks you can do. It's a really powerful feeling game, but it never evolves. It just stays the same the whole way through. It's that game you fire up and for the first hour or two you'll be like, man, he's crazy. What's he talking about? Why does he think this is so bad? But as you get deeper and you realize it's just on a same equal plane the whole way through from start to finish. There's no incline, there's no decline either. It's just perfectly mundane the whole way through, where I don't hate it, and I wouldn't say it's an awful Spider-Man game, but Friend or Foe needed to evolve its combat continuously to be more fun. But you kind of just rinse and repeat the same aerial combos, slam combos, and no matter how many characters you unlock, you start using the same button combinations for them. The upgrade trees aren't meaningful enough, where I know it's a game really about the roster because the special thing is you're fighting with the villains. I think it would have been better if it was maybe more of an Ultimate Alliance or an X-Men Legends style game, although I haven't played X-Men Legends, which is something we're saving for when the X-Men stuff starts coming around. Don't worry. But I think that sort of 4-player co-op action RPG would have worked really well here. But I get they wanted to differentiate from what Ultimate Alliance was doing, and it felt like a game caught in the middle that just couldn't find its identity. And so it was really just about playing as Spider-Man villains, but none of them felt different in a meaningful way. Like, everyone was, you know, for example, the Green Goblin would be on his feet still for the most part. It didn't feel like any character was really particularly different. And so, yeah, it just started to feel like the game's big moments would glance off you, and ultimately you're just left feeling flat throughout it, where I want to defend this game. I don't hate it, but there's a reason why when I first rented it, because I was like, oh, I'm in the mood for a Spider-Man game, so I picked it up at Blockbuster, and I played it for 4 hours and then just moved on to something else. And I always thought to myself, why? And then I tried playing it again and got barely that deep and thought, okay, now I know why, because it just doesn't evolve. And I think that's so important in video games, is to continue to evolve. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the, quote, worst Spider-Man games. It was a fun experiment because I found how great I think Maximum Carnage and Separation Anxiety can be. I rediscovered a bad game from my childhood in Spider-Man and the Sinister Six, and also, you know, I beat a game that gave me a title card at the end saying, congrats, you beat the game. Worth it. Worth it. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on these Spider-Man games. Are there any I didn't mention here that you think are among the worst of the worst? I know there's ones from Atari, for example, but I think that's like a low-hanging fruit. Like, how much more could we have done back then? I tried to be reasonable with this list, so let me know. And with that, I'll catch all of you in the next Retro Rebound. Peace out.